Good afternoon. This is Scott Hopkins at LPA Software Solutions. Many of you know LPA Software Solutions over the years as we've worked with you as a deep analytics consulting and services firm. One of the things that we pride ourselves in is that our focus in deep analytics, and all we do is analytics day in, day out. But as we've worked with many of you over the years, we constantly get questions about cybersecurity and security of our environment as we're working with you to develop analytics, analytic dashboards, and analytic reporting. So we looked at how do we provide that capability to you as our clients without compromising our belief that in order to be a very, very effective consulting and services firm, that you focus and remain focused. So we've decided to partner with GreyCastle. GreyCastle Security is very similar in nature to LPA in that one of their uniquenesses is all they do day in, day out is security and cybersecurity. Their deep expertise with years of experience with former CIOs, former CISOs, allows them to provide advice, counsel, implementations of security services. So today we'd like to bring to our clients the ability to get to know GreyCastle, and we're going to do that through Dan Didier, who's going to take us through the GreyCastle capability. Dan brings with him nearly 20 years of very detailed security experience in a wide range of industries: critical infrastructure, finance, healthcare, manufacturing, and other prominent industries. So we hope this complementary relationship that we've developed with GreyCastle Security for their deep expertise in security and our deep expertise in analytics provides a seamless way to work with many of our clients in that pursuit of both analytics and security in their environment. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan Didier.
Oh, thank you for that nice introduction, and welcome to the presentation. My name is Dan, and I work with GreyCastle Security. I'm the Vice President of Services here, and I have the pleasure of working with a large group of cybersecurity professionals. One of the services that we provide is incident response. I'm going to talk about some of the things we've learned today, some of the things that I think every business should consider, and we'll provide some insights to really help you ask the right questions and have awareness enough to be able to understand if you're doing the right things, and give you some comfort around how you can talk to other people in your organization about this, and ultimately understand that this is not a technology issue, it is a strategic business issue. It's about resilience. So to that point, I'd like to talk a little bit about our vision statement, because I believe that this is the perfect explanation of how every organization should think about cybersecurity. GreyCastle's vision is to be the world's leading provider of relevant, practical, and effective cybersecurity solutions. You can think of this as blue-collar security. Nothing should be more complex than it needs to be. Everything should be as simple as possible without being too simple. And that is our vision. Solving problems with complex technical solutions, especially when they're business problems, is never effective. And I'm not saying that technology is not part of the solution, but there is a bigger picture here. So let's get started with a little background. Where did we come from? Where are we now? A lot of you may remember this, the old rotary phone, and some of you may even still know where there's one or two of these in operation. Well, interestingly enough, 1892 is when this technology started, and some of the internet still runs on this technology. Now, if you think about the fact that the rotary phone and the phone network as it started is still working in some areas of this country, that's pretty crazy, right? Over 100 years. How much technology do we have today that we expect to last that long? Not that much. And if you look at the rate of how quickly things have been changing, you really start to understand what that means to us from a how do I keep up from a complexity perspective, and specifically in relation to incident response. we're going to have issues come up that we just don't understand. So Amjad Alvi, he's credited with creating the first PC-based virus. 1986, not that long ago, and it wasn't even what we would think about today as being malicious. It was simply a boot sector virus that informed people when they copied the floppy disks illegally that they could tell it was a copy and they should go license the software legally. This is what it looked like. Pretty old stuff. To this, which this is Elvis and Amir. These guys pulled $45 million out of an ATM in 24 hours. That is quite a difference if we think about viruses and malware and attacks and how computer systems and information systems are used to exploit businesses. The pace and the impact is increasing significantly. Well, of course, to this, right? Equifax, 140 million plus people's sensitive information stolen. Names, driver's licenses, social security numbers, birth dates, addresses, pretty much everything you care about. Did you even know all of this information was in one place? Probably not. And how do we know where our information is going to be compromised next? Do businesses know where their information is? And do they have the right assurances that security is going to protect them? The answer is undoubtedly no. And if we think about what's happening here, cybercrime today, and it is crime, it's organized. And reports have shown that 80% of these attacks are driven by organized crime. It's a financially motivated activity. And it's the best case scenario for these guys because they don't have to go in and commit armed robbery and get thrown in jail and harm people's lives directly anyway. It's all done behind the screen of a computer, usually in another country. This is another reason why we are where we are. We're dealing with this on a massive scale. The other thing to know is that criminals have gotten very organized. What you're looking at here is actually something very rare. This is an artifact left behind by an organized crime ring that compromised a network and was preparing to encrypt their systems with ransomware. And what you see in the box here is they were deciding how much the ransom would cost in total Bitcoin. Well, if you want to unlock all of your systems, it's going to be 7 Bitcoins. And if you only want to do 1 or 2 hosts, we're going to charge you a little under 1 Bitcoin. This shows you how much of a business process this is. So when did this all start, this idea of incident response? Because it feels like I've been talking about it forever, but the reality is that I haven't been. And many organizations still don't really understand what it is. Well, in 2003, the US-CERT partnered up with Carnegie Mellon and created the first incident response capability. So it's a government partnership with private institution that said, look, we've got this internet, there's some things going on, we need to be able to respond. And this was really very much like you might think about how the government would do things, the military style tactics and formation of team and the response capabilities. But you know what? It's valid and it's real because the types of attacks, the speed and impacts at which they can affect us are significant. But that's not that long ago. That's 15 years ago. And I'll tell you, in 2003, most businesses and cybersecurity professionals, if we could even call them cybersecurity professionals at that point, weren't really thinking about this in these terms. So it's progressed from there, of course, but I think my point is 15 years is not a long time at all. And it happens every day. Excelis, Blue Shield, Blue Cross, this was a few years ago, but the thing I want to talk about here is that the criminals were in their network for over a year before Excelis found out about it. Can you imagine the amount of information and access to systems that these people had? And the scary part is this happens every day, and it will continue to happen. To this, right? Facebook, it was huge. 50, 60 million people, 80 million people. The number kept rising. had their information compromised, not necessarily by a criminal in the way that we've been talking about here, but by an organization that had a partnership with Facebook and used that information in ways that would certainly not be okay with you and I, but also that violated the contract that they had with Facebook. But this is another example of the types of threats that we're dealing with today. So a little background, a little history, get us prepared for the next segment here, which is why we're vulnerable. Well, first, it's business complexity. So at the top of the list is the fact that we've got a lot of things going on. Large businesses, small businesses, mid-sized businesses all have a lot of complexity. They've got people, they've got processes, they've got technology they're managing. And think about this. The last time that you went to Target and you tried to check out and walk through the door and those alarms went off, what happened? Did they just kind of flag you through, say, oh, that's all right, this happens all the time? That's absolutely what happens. This is the same exact thing that happened with the Target breach. They had a lot of technology. They were audited by third parties. They had compliance and security programs in place. They had dashboards with flashing red lights that said, hey, you are being attacked. The attack that ultimately led to the breach that they had was right in their face. The problem is there were 1,000 other blinking lights, and they were just kind of wading their way through it and waving themselves on, if you would. Then we have economics, right? There's a toolkit called Black Hole, made by this gentleman, Dimitri. Believe it or not, he's now in jail, which is a very interesting story in itself. But we don't have time for that today, unfortunately. So what happens? Well, Dimitri grows up and he has an option. He can either be poor and barely scrape by, or he can join an organized crime ring and exploit the resources of American businesses and individuals. And that's exactly what he did. And in fact, he built a toolkit that enabled other people that didn't need elite hacker skills or even minimal hacker skills to compromise organizations and leverage that data and the access to those systems to make money. So, we've got this economic challenge that all around the world, people have intelligence, they have capability, but they don't have opportunity. So in some cases, it goes the wrong way. Yes, politics also plays a role. There's this idea of cooperation. There's even concepts, in law, international laws, things like jurisprudence, where if our laws don't match your laws, then guess what? If someone commits a crime in my country that you would consider a crime, but our laws don't match, then they're not in trouble. It's not a crime in our country, or it's not a crime in their country. And this is exactly what's happening. So it's almost impossible for us to apprehend these criminals, never mind the complexity around identifying who they actually are and where they're actually coming from. Then we have this. Perhaps one of the biggest problems out there. Your security feelings don't match reality, period. We all know that distracted driving is perhaps one of the most dangerous things in the world. However, you've got control of that. You decide to pick up that phone or not. If I said, hey, it's time for us to go take a step into the shark pool, literally a pool with sharks in it, nobody would do that, even though the reality is you're much less likely to get hurt by those sharks. They're not going to bite you. And then we have vending machines, which unfortunately seriously hurt or kill many more people than sharks ever would. Yet you'd be perfectly comfortable walking by these things every single day. So your feelings just don't match reality. And this same concept applies to the security of your business in relation to these very complex technical issues that influence our business process and the way that our people operate. We just don't get it. Of course, then we have people, right? The fact that my feelings are mostly influencing what I do and everyone feels a little differently is a major problem. One of the core challenges that we see is getting organizations to adopt a process that avoids emotion, that takes kind of the traditional gut feeling out of things, because it's been shown over and over and over again that gut feelings around cybersecurity and the resilience of your business just are not effective. One more thing to add here. If you haven't heard about privacy issues lately, they've really been boiling up. We talk about cybersecurity and information security. Now we're talking a lot about privacy. They're really hard to separate, but the thing I want to say is, people are becoming more and more aware of not only whether there's been a breach or not, but if you're handling their sensitive information in a way that is reasonable and respective of their wishes. Are you sharing this information with third parties? Are you selling this data? What are you doing with that data that you have that they're trusting you with? So privacy, especially if you look to the European Union and things like GDPR, are becoming a central focal point tied to this whole issue. Don't forget, you are absolutely a target. Myself, as an individual, you as an individual, your business partners, your competitors, every single business is a target. There's an opportunity for criminals to do a lot of damage here, and they take advantage of that in any way that they can. You don't have to have sensitive data. A lot of people say, well, why would they want my data? Well, if you've heard about ransomware, or if you haven't, that's why. All they have to do is take away your ability to get to your data. And now you've got a major problem. And this is where I talk briefly about the CIA triad. And it's really what we care about in cybersecurity, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those three things are how I think about security. Have I lost confidentiality? So those are the targets of the world, the breaches. What about integrity? Is my data accurate? And then availability, can I get to my data? And this is really what ransomware takes advantage of and is highly effective at getting organizations to pay to release that ransom. So it's not that I really care about your data, and while your data may not be valuable to a lot of folks, it's very valuable to you. Moving on, this is just a quick self-assessment. And what I'd like everybody to do is just think about how prepared are you? So does your organization have an incident response plan? It's a simple yes, no. I think everyone on this webinar can answer that question. And please remember your answer. We're going to come back to this. All right, so moving ahead, how do we actually plan for failure? First of all, I'll say that sounds terrible, but that's what we're doing. The incident response plan is put into motion when we have a failure. It's how we recover. It's how we limit our exposure. So what do we have to do? Well, if you ask the wrong questions at the wrong time, you don't have a plan. And I want to make a point here that you should have some sort of muscle memory, some sort of ability to understand at a high level what we need to do and who is responsible. And if you're asking a lot of questions, if you answered earlier where you said, well, we do have a plan, if you flip that thing open and say, well, where do we start? And what do I do? And what does this mean? You don't have a plan. You've got a piece of paper that you don't understand. So what's involved here? What do we have to do? Well, at the core, we have incident command. Somebody has to be in control, and that somebody has to understand all of these areas to enough of a degree to be able to coordinate, and they have to understand what the business needs us to do. So coordinating forensics and crisis communications and compliance and legal, information technology, law enforcement, and any investigations that we have to do, either internally or externally or in partnership, all comes back to this idea of incident command. This is our job. It is not an IT function. This is a business function, and there are many different areas that require our attention. So step one is triage. And if you think about triage, this term actually came around in World War I. And it's, it is what it is. What we have to do is understand where we need to focus our time and energy to reduce the impact the most and recover our business operations. So we need to assign degrees of urgency to wounded or ill patients. In this case, we are the wounded or ill patient. And unfortunately, there's this process you go through, which is saying, let me look at this individual or this area of the business. Is no matter how much time or energy I spend, it is not likely to recover. Stop. I don't do anything. And then I go to the other end of the spectrum. I say, okay, if I spend just a little bit of time on this patient or this business function, it'll be okay. So I do that. I spend the minimum amount of time so I can come back later and button that up. And then I take the rest of my energy and focus it on what's in the middle, the one that we say, we're not quite sure. They may make it, they may not, but because I prioritized appropriately, I can maximize the chances of success. And this is absolutely what we do in triage around incident response. So there's a couple things. We need to be prepared for surprises. So the plan helps us to ask the right questions and have the right processes in place, but there will always be surprises. And we always need to manage expectations of our people, of our teams, all of our resources to make sure that we're doing the right things at the right time to the right degree. Step 2 is you need to build your team. So if you don't have a team, get a team. And there's some interesting things we've learned here, which is incident response is a unique function. Not everyone is good at this. Not everyone can do this. So we really need to find the people that will serve us the best in these cases. Basically, they're born, not made, and you can enhance those capabilities, but if someone just doesn't have it in them, it's not going to work out well. Now, even if you have a natural ability for it, we still need to train you. We need to take advantage of that capability and make sure that it's effective, and we need to give explicit yet flexible direction. We need some outlines here. We need some guidelines. We need some process that we can leverage to move through this incident. And we need to prepare for the unexpected. This comes up again. So the flexibility is very important. The guidelines are important. But knowing that things will come at us that we just haven't prepared for is something we also need to know and understand and be comfortable with. Step 3 is you need to know how and when to perform forensics. Forensics is a very specific function of incident response. So if we get to that level, if we believe we need to do this because we believe there may be some sort of litigation as one of the primary factors, then we need to have a process in place to do that. And one of the things that we recommend is that we allow attorneys to drive the investigation. This is a surprise to a lot of folks. Attorneys, incident response. At the highest level, this is a business legal issue, and they are the ones that will use this forensic data to determine things like if there was a breach, or if there was an exposure, or if it was a reportable breach. So the forensics is here to help us establish an understanding, and then in the majority of cases, it feeds into that legal process. Now, if we're collecting data and information and assets, we need to have a secure location. If you're just piling them up in your office, don't assume that that's secure and that will allow that evidence to be submitted in a court of law. We need to log everything. So the forensic function needs to look at many assets, lots of different data sets, and those assessments and investigations need to be logged and recorded. We need to ensure that resources are trained, educated, and certified. So forensics is a profession. It is not something our IT team can do. It is a blend of technology and criminal justice and investigation. These people have degrees in incident response and forensics. If you don't know what you're doing or you don't think you can afford to stand this sort of capability up, outsource it. Have somebody that knows what they're doing do it. Step 4, I just talked about, we're going to look at logs most likely. Well, if your information systems aren't generating logs, guess what? We're going to have a really hard time from a legal perspective of determining if there was a breach or not. Or we may not have enough information to sway us one way or another, and we may have to lean toward breach when maybe in fact there wasn't. Now, one thing I want to say is that you don't just turn logging on. There's many options, and the systems that you need to collect logs from, number 1, you need to know which systems, and number 2, you need to know which types of logs you need. So this is a pretty significant effort, but at the highest level, you need a formal plan for logging, and it needs to be validated. And there are going to be many different asset owners that will contribute to this. they need to have a clear understanding of what those goals and objectives are. All right. Moving on to 5. So performing actual investigations. So when you're in this incident response function and you're doing triage and you may or may not be doing forensics, ultimately you're doing an investigation that is helping you to understand, was something stolen? Was something accessed? If so, did it leave our network? How much left the network? Was that sensitive information? One of the most important things here is knowing what is worth stealing. Do you know what your data assets are and where they are? Things like PHI or PII or financial information. And if you think you know, I'll ask you some other questions. Well, how many records do you have? Is it 1 or 1,000 or 1,000,000? And is it only on one system in your data center, or is it on multiple systems? Is it in the cloud? Have you shared it with business partners? If you don't know where your data is, it's really hard to do an investigation. And then understanding indicators of compromise, like things that we learned from those logs, like systems not working properly, like large data flows out of your network. All of these things that we look for to help us focus our energy in this investigation, these are things that you need to be prepared to do. And then once you do collect some sort of information, ensuring that we're preserving that evidence correctly. So last bullet, prepare for the unexpected. The nature of which these attacks occur and how they are executed are ever changing. You will never be fully prepared. You will always find something new, and that's what we've learned. Okay, reporting. So, important part of your plan is to know how to report. Who am I going to have to report this to, and in what time frame? So understand your reporting requirements and maintain notification templates. Look, in the heat of the moment, you are not going to be able to pull together very cohesive and effective reporting statements. You need to have some level of preparedness here. And it's very likely that your industry and your business partners will have some pretty clear requirements. If you don't know what those are ahead of time, you may fail to do this. And if you fail to report on time, for example, in the case of HIPAA, guess what? That can be a significant fine in itself. A lot of these reporting requirements use the terms reasonable for what the time frame is. More and more, though, this is being tightened up. That is something our attorney decides, nobody else, because that's a legal decision. And you absolutely need to know the difference between an exposure, an event, an incident, and a breach. They are not the same thing. They mean vastly different things to you, to regulators, to business partners, to legal teams, and they have vastly different consequences of you saying you've had one of those or not. Very important what you say and how you say it. Your plan should define those for you. So if you haven't figured it out by now, make sure your attorney's involved. Make sure you have an attorney that understands cybersecurity and breaches and investigations. And unfortunately, you need to prepare to be sued by your customers, your partners, banks, and regulatory bodies, and anyone else. So when we decide, how we retain data, our legal team should be doing that for us. So if you just keep all of your data forever, that's not necessarily a smart move. We should be deleting data periodically that we no longer need because it minimizes our exposure. And if you have cloud services, and who doesn't today, you should have your attorney interface with them when you need information from them, like logs as to who may have logged in or other indicators of compromise that you need to understand to do your investigation. This can be a huge, huge stumbling block. By getting the attorneys involved early, it helps to reduce that time necessary to get the information we need. And of course, attorneys should be included in all the key decisions, including the impact, the reporting, and breach determination. Let me make this simple. In many cases, it's not black and white. The attorney will collect lots and lots of information from the incident responders, from the forensic team, from law enforcement. They're going to go to the CEO and say, look, based on this criteria, we had these 8 things that we're basing our breach determination on. There's a 60% probability that you had a breach. Mr. or Mrs. CEO, what would you like to do? And therein lies the rub. This is very difficult because there are many potential impacts associated with going one way or the other. And that's outside the scope of this presentation, but as you can imagine, that's a very, very difficult decision to make when it's not black or white. So make sure that we test and train effectively. Now, we found good people, we've got a plan, we pay attention to what's going on in our industry and in the news, and we understand what's happened to our business partners, but we are unique, and our plan is our plan. We need to train our team on our plan, make sure that we're testing, so training and testing. In some way, shape, or form, we should be measuring our ability to respond. How good did we do in this test? Was it a reasonable amount of time for us to make progress, or did we not even get past the first step because no one knew what was going on? They didn't understand it. And if you don't budget to do this and plan to do this, you won't do it. It costs time and it costs money. Set expectations for the IT staff. IT is a part of the incident response team. They do not run incident response. They're not capable, quite honestly. It's just a fact. It's not good or bad, but ensure that those IT roles are clearly defined and understood. And I think this is very, very important because for a long time now, we've had a misconception that, this is an IT function. So don't assume that they know the law and don't assume that they know how to conduct an investigation because that could be catastrophic. Number 10, your liability insurance, cyber liability insurance. This is mandatory for most organizations, especially if you do business with anybody else and you touch their data or systems in any way, shape, or form. Not all policies are created equal. Make sure that you understand the fine print, know what options you have or don't for engaging with third parties to help you with incident response. And quite honestly, prepare for a battle. If you have an incident and there are impacts and damages that you've had, they're going to send you a form and say, okay, fill out the form and tell us what the costs were. In large organizations, things that I've seen on these things are line items like 4,000 pizzas to feed our staff over the weekend as they worked 24/7, and on, things that you would never assume. If you have a policy, it probably requires you to have an incident response plan. It probably requires you to test that plan and to update that plan. It may even require you to have a cybersecurity program. If you don't do those things and you can't show that you are maintaining those programs in line with their expectations, you may have no insurance. And of course, ensure that those limits are appropriate. As we get more familiar with the outcomes and we understand better what the true costs are, undoubtedly, I've seen them going up. So limits probably should be reviewed periodically, and it's not uncommon to see organizations bumping those up. Okay, number 11, be able to clearly communicate exposure, breach, event, or incident. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this because I think it is that important. Did we have an exposure or a breach? Was it an event or an incident? Your incident response plan needs to define this clearly, and the team needs to know exactly what these different definitions mean and what they require us to do. You should never say we had a breach without your attorney validating that, because only an attorney can determine that. If you say it, by the way, at GreyCastle we call it the B word. We never say it, in fact, and even though we facilitated hundreds of incidents and worked with many, many organizations and investigations, law enforcement, and attorneys, we've never determined if a client has had a breach. We've supported that effort endlessly and worked with those attorneys that absolutely will make that decision. Now, if you say breach and you don't have a breach, an auditor may show up at your door. Business partners are going to be calling you. If it gets into the media, you're not going to be able to do your job, and nobody's going to be able to do their job for weeks at your business when someone just used the wrong word. It's very important. Okay, so to recap here, we've got incident command at the center, right? We've got all these other functions kind of surrounding this process, and they all have their job to do. We all have a piece of this puzzle. We need to be able to coordinate. We need to be able to have a common understanding of what we should do, what we should not do. equally as important, and when we should do it. The incident command function allows us to coordinate these things and report up if we need to report out if we need to, but none of these groups should be doing any outside communication. Do not hack back. In fact, this is illegal. You will go to jail. You do live in the US of A, most likely, and we have laws against that. So there's a lot of talk about this. Just don't do it. So what are some lessons that we've learned from actual response? People find this very interesting. So let's get started. Definitions. So I've talked about this to death. I have seen real cost to businesses where if you don't know the differences between exposure, events, incidents, and breaches, you are more likely to have a breach. That's right. Because in the process of doing an investigation, you're pulling a lot of sensitive information together. And we have actually seen where organizations have failed to secure that information as they shared that with people that was helping them. Third parties. Oh, I just emailed off that spreadsheet that had all the sensitive data in it to my IT guys. Oops. Know what to do, know what it means, and know how to act. Insurance. Know what it is and what it isn't, and know that you may not get a policy without a program or an incident response plan, right? And know that your breach may not be covered if the carrier deems you negligent to perform reasonable duty. Now, there's one bullet missing I want to talk about here. GreyCastle worked on the largest ransomware attack in history, right? Publicly known, and that was with Erie County Medical out of Buffalo, New York. And one thing that we learned is their policy for insurance, which was $1 million, didn't even come close to covering their expenses, which was over $10 million. Somehow, some way, they decided to bump that up to $10 million just a couple months before they had this incident. And my point here is really understand the value of insurance, what limits you might need, and what you have to do to ensure that when you need it, it will be there. IT. So we talked about, IT not being forensic experts or investigators. We really need to maintain a list of contacts for law enforcement, digital forensic experts, and attorneys. And we need to be prepared for this. It should be in your plan. We can't and we shouldn't put people on our team in a bad position and set them up for failure because we didn't do our homework and we don't really understand what we're doing. One big thing, if you are in IT or, ask your IT folks, some of the largest breaches that we've seen and some of the largest incidents that we've seen have been because of this thing called RDP, Remote Desktop Protocol. It's a very common way for people to connect remotely to their computers at work. And unfortunately, there's a lot of risk associated with this. Turn this off or ensure you have the appropriate controls to limit access via just a username and password to your whole computing environment, please. Disaster recovery. So ransomware, I talked about confidentiality, integrity, and availability as the three things we care about, the CIA triad, and how ransomware has really highlighted availability as something all of a sudden we care about a lot. Well, there's another thing that's been going on, which is over time, backups. They've moved away from tapes, right? And we've moved to online backups where it's much faster, it's cheaper, it's on a hard drive, it's available, we can get stuff quickly. The problem with that is if you're targeted for a ransomware attack and they encrypt not only your computer systems that you use on a daily basis, but the same system that you use to back up your data to a computer, you don't have any options for recovery outside of paying that ransom. And I've got news for you. The ransom doesn't always work. These bad guys aren't all technologists. And if it breaks or doesn't work for some reason, they move on. So we have seen some terrible impacts to organizations because they didn't understand this threat and this risk, and their information system backup plans didn't provide them with the resilience that they needed. So please, please, please pay attention to that and ask some questions and make sure that you've got what you need. Communication. Listen, if you don't tell your story, someone else will. So know what to say, who to say it to, and when to say it. Reporters are absolutely not technologists. They're not lawyers. They're not instant responders, but they will tell your story. Make sure that you have a tight lid on information leaks. Make sure that your internal communication plan says who and how we communicate. And certainly develop those templates, both for internal, external, and for your business partners and regulatory audiences, whoever that may be. Public relations, The Onion. I love this example because they did a great job. So sometimes being really transparent can be the right move. It can disarm and diffuse the situation. Certainly saying the wrong thing can infuriate people. So I've got, The Onion had a breach. They had someone accessed their systems and stole your email address. Most likely that was about it, your name and email address, maybe your phone number. It was very low level, but they actually responded in a way with humor, and it worked. Now, this might not work for other organizations, but they said a lot of really funny things, and they gave you some recommendations on how you can be more secure, as you can see here. Like to keep your phone data safe at all times, never unlock your phone. And it worked, right? People chuckled. They said, but again, the impact wasn't huge, right? It was a name and an email address. Messaging. And yes, I pick on Anthem here. It's very likely that you or someone you know was affected by the Anthem breach. 80 million people, your healthcare data, your personally identifiable information associated with this. I got the letter in the mail, and it said this: Anthem's own associates' personal information, including my own, was accessed during this security breach. We join you in your concern and frustration, and I assure you that we are working around the clock to do everything we can to further secure your data. That's from the CEO. That really, really made me mad. Because not only did the first part of this letter said, look, we had all the right controls, we had, our compliance was good, we had auditors validate that. But then they said, well, don't worry, our data was compromised too, so we're going to work really, really hard. Well, I thought, does that mean if your information wasn't compromised, you would work less hard? This is a great example of one of the worst communication and messaging scenarios that I've seen especially from a large organization such as this. Just totally ticked me off. And it should do the same to you. Not only that, they sent my 2-year-old daughter 2 letters in the mail. So when people start talking about the cost of data breaches, how much does it cost to stuff and mail an envelope? And how many people received 2 copies of that? Well, if you had 80 million people and you're thinking it's 50 cents each or maybe 30 cents with a discount, well, you just doubled your cost from 40 million in mailing to 80 million. Pretty dumb. So what's next? Let's wrap this up. One of the most important things is that you need to keep calm and carry on. Period. If you have a plan, it helps you do that. If you don't have a plan and you're not confident and tested, guess what? You cannot keep calm unless you're a very unique person. This is perhaps my favorite slide. Of course, this is Mike Tyson, and one of his quotes, I think, is very effective here. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. This is absolutely true. So even if you have that plan, you will have something unexpected happen, and it's going to throw a curveball at you. So the better you know that plan, the more tested you are, the better off you're going to be. So you need to build a defensible position, period. This, perhaps, is one of the most important things. If you're determined to be negligent because you were supposed to have an incident response plan or you were supposed to have a cybersecurity program, that is the worst case scenario. And that is when the regulators and the auditors and your business partners come down on you the hardest. And quite honestly, from a legal perspective, they have the right to do that, and the fines are very high. You need to build a defensible position, and doing this, as we've described here, will help you to do that. So if this is your responsibility, first of all, you need to build a defensible position for yourself, and you need to build a defensible position for your business. So let's take this self-assessment again real quick. If you would like to, please raise your hand. Does your organization have an incident response plan? I think pretty much everyone's hand is up right now. Number 2, has it been tested? Aha, well, hands start to go down now. Will your plan be effective? Well, I don't know. We never had to use it. Hands go down. And does your plan have the right representation? Do you have the right people on your incident response team? And almost undoubtedly, there's only a couple of hands standing at this point, which is scary to me, because I know if you don't have the right representation, if you don't have the right people and you don't have the right business units participating, we're going to fail. Okay, so there's some resources listed here. I'm not going to go through these verbatim, but know that there are some very smart people that have done this for a while now, and they've published very good guidelines for you to use. For reporting, there's some things that are really important. FTC, I think, safeguards rule is one of the best places to go. There's a guide for business, right? Certainly, if you have contracts or other industry regulations, they will point you to the things you have to do as well. So how can we help? Well, first of all, if you haven't gathered by now, GreyCastle Security does incident response. We have a 24/7, 365 capability. We do this for clients, and we do this for folks that aren't our clients. We do this every day, unfortunately, and we have all the right resources necessary to help you through this process, from digital forensic experts to attorneys. This is one of our core competencies. You might be saying, well, how can we prevent this? Well, we can also build a plan and help you test, so that's good. And another thing, we do a lot of other cybersecurity related services. I think one place you could start is to see how susceptible you might be is do a vulnerability assessment. And I'm not talking about necessarily just a scan, do a vulnerability assessment with the focus of seeing how vulnerable you might be to an external attack or an internal attack. And everything from do we have RDP open to how good do we do at patching our systems to is our firewall configured in a secure manner. Those are all things that fall under vulnerability assessment. So certainly now, we're going to answer some of your questions. I do want to say, I'd like to hear back from folks. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. I post things once in a while. They're usually of value or very thought-provoking, and I like to get feedback from the folks that are trying to solve these business problems.
Thanks, Dan, for that great presentation. We are now going to move into the Q&A session. Our first question is, can you go into more detail about the difference between an event, an incident, exposure, and a breach?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question, and it is really of the utmost importance to make sure everybody knows what those are and what the differences are, because depending on how we classify what's going on, is this an event, is it an exposure, is it an incident, a breach, we're going to react in different ways. I think at the simplest level, an event you could put in front of that security. So a security event is, they happen every day. You have someone scans your network. Your firewall shows that there were unauthorized access attempts. Somebody locks their account, whether it's on accident or it's something malicious, and so on and so forth. Now, many of those events are simply logged and no further action is taken. However, some of those security events can turn into an incident. And that's when, there is actually an impact associated with that event. And certainly once the incident is declared, one of the key things to remember is then your incident response plan goes into effect, okay? And everyone starts doing what they do. Now, as part of an incident, there could be an exposure. And typically when we talk about exposure, we're thinking about data. So let's think of some simple things. Well, an unauthorized user logged in to a system, and they may have seen some records. So that's an exposure or a potential exposure. Let's say we did confirm that they saw a certain number of records. Now we would investigate that further to say, well, did those records leave in any way, shape, or form? Was that data exfiltrated? Because certainly we're starting to build up the criteria to determine how much risk there is, and then ultimately working toward, is that a breach or not? So these different ways of describing the activities and the outcomes and the impacts of events ultimately are what help us to know how to respond, who to inform, and what we do next. So thank you. Great question.
Thanks, Dan, for explaining that. Our next question reads, you spoke about building an incident response team. How regularly should that team be trained? And you also said give them explicit yet flexible direction. Can you clarify what that is?
Yeah, another really good question. We work with a number of organizations, and I would say that most organizations have a minimum requirement of training annually. But to be quite honest, an annual training session really isn't enough to be practiced and ready to respond. Some of the most effective organizations that we see actually have a monthly training exercise. And certainly there are other cadences you can come up with. What I would say is it really should be based on a number of factors. Number one, how experienced that team is, how well they understand the incident response process, and how much risk exists in that organization as to responding to incidents. So what do we anticipate the frequency or the impact of those sort of activities to be, and how do we best prepare? As far as being explicit in direction but giving flexibility, I think what happens here is the plan needs to be very clear about which levers are pulled at what time, but give some options for flexibility inside those bounds. For example, when you get into the stage of where you believe there may be some sort of breach, there's going to be a requirement to get legal advice and potentially reach out to law enforcement. But that final decision can be left up to in-house counsel or the incident commander. So there's a recommendation made at that point, and we need to review what information we know. So there's a call to action to say, well, maybe we need to get some third-party assistance, but let's take the information we have and the specific event and scenario that we're dealing with and use that information to make that decision. So we're asked to remember it's time to consider this, and now we need to look at the specifics. So
Gotcha.
it's explicit yet flexible.
Thanks, Dan. Our next question says, what is the best way to start understanding your assets and how much that they are worth?
Yeah, okay. So this is really hard, and many organizations struggle with this. The good news is that this same understanding of what do I have and how valuable is it does not apply only to incident response. In fact, it's a critical piece of doing an organizational risk assessment of any kind and helping you prioritize your gaps based on the impact of the organization. You have to start to build an inventory of those data assets. And what I would say is don't be confused. A data asset is not a computer or a firewall or some other device or system. Those are information assets, and they support the storage, transmission, and processing of actual data assets. A data asset truly is the data. So if you're in healthcare, we're talking about PHI. If you're in banking or finance, we're talking about those account numbers and the related financial information. If you're in other businesses where you have personally identifiable information, that is the data we care about. And certainly you can go on and on with the different types of valuable data sets. But one of the most important things is that when you start to build an inventory of those assets, realize that IT doesn't own any data. They are data custodians. The data is owned by the departments that need that data to run. For example, human resources owns human resource data. The finance department owns the finance data. If you're in healthcare, that PHI is owned on the clinical side of the house. IT doesn't own the data. But understanding who owns the data and what those data sets are and documenting that is a critical part to understanding the value, and certainly then asking yourself, well, how much do we have? Is it one record or is it 1 million? Because that increases the potential impact associated with some sort of compromise or event. And secondarily, you ask yourself, from an organizational perspective, what is the confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements of each data set? And that allows you to build a value associated with that we can understand from an incident response perspective. So I'll recap. You need to build an inventory of all your data types, who owns it, how much you have, and what the CIA or confidentiality, integrity, and availability requirements are.
Great, thanks, Dan. I think that's a great place to start. Thank you again for answering all those questions. That looks like that is all we have for today. I would just like to thank everyone again for joining us for today's webinar, and I look forward to speaking with you guys again soon.
Thank you. And again, thank you to everyone in the audience. Look forward to talking to you.